So this painting is what I was doing in 1985. It's called Trench Town, which came from listening to a Bob Marley song. I wanted to be an abstract expressionist. And I think several things happened around that shift from abstraction to text. And one of them was Whitney Independent Study Program, if people know what that is. So this is a painting from maybe 1990. And it was around the time I started first using text, and it was a sort of a solution to a problem. The problem was the content of the abstract paintings that I was making wasn't really there for me, or the content, or at least I think the vocabulary in which I was working in when I was working abstractly couldn't really contain the things that I was interested, the texts that I was reading, the films I was seeing, the work of other artists that I was interested in. And so I was trying to figure out a way to how to sort of put new content into the work. And one of the ways I thought to do that was very simple, was just to simply take the things that I was reading and make the work out of that. And I was, this is another painting that came after that first painting. It's stenciled on, 1990, stenciled on doors. I realized a lot of the texts that I was attracted to had the word I in them. And so there was this sort of confusion between me as an artist using a text, who was writing this sentence, what subject position were they writing from, and that confusion became part of what the work was about. But also the format, because they literally were on doors, was about the body and about this standardized thing that was scaled to the human body and what that possibly meant. And a lot of my work deals with this kind of transition, I guess, from something legible to something abstract, or something hidden, or some knowledge not quite available, but somehow opaque. A lot of the work deals with that kind of question. But at the time, early 80s, when I was in the Whitney program, people like Barbara Kruger were coming in to lecture, and so that possibility, very different kind of use of text, very different in terms of like the use of images in the world, advertising, a sort of signature that she has around her use of text, feminism as integrated into her practice. Super interesting to see her lecture. Again, I don't know if it was influential in a deep way at the moment. It became more important over time. Jenny Holzer, also I think 82, in Times Square. I think one of her truisms, I think that's what this is from, but on this very famous light board in Times Square, so seen by millions of people, this text would appear kind of at night for a couple of months as a public art project. And actually, this is the New York Times old headquarters, so that sort of strip of black around there would be where the news would sort of do a crawl around the building. So that was super interesting to me. Isaac Julian, a production still from Looking for Langston. I met Isaac when I first went to London in, I think, 89. It was a bit of an intellectual boot camp for me because I met Isaac Julian, I met Kobina Mercer, I met Stuart Hall, and I realized that the debates going on around blackness and representation in the UK were way ahead of where we were in the United States. And so people like Isaac, who were still friends, became super important in terms of like opening up to, for me, of certain kinds of theoretical debates around the black body, about the archive and fantasy when there's not an archive to actually draw from. How do you deal with that? Or even the archive as a subject. That's another painting. Stencil door, starting at the top, going to the bottom. As the text is being written, it starts to disappear and disintegrate. A smaller drawing, a little fragment from a novel by Gertrude Stein called 3 Lives. There are 3 sort of little novellas put together as one larger book. And the novella that I've taken this text from was called Melanctha, Each One As She May, and it's Stein writing. I think the book was published 1923. It's her first published book, and the characters that she's writing about in this section of the novel are African American. They live in a sort of segregated town in the South, and so she's writing about their lives, what she imagines their life. It's fictional, but she's imagining sort of their lives. And actually, the exact sentence that I took it from was Stein is describing this character named Rose, and she says something like, Rose doesn't have the, wide open joy of the Negroes. She doesn't have their Negro sunshine. Her laugh is any woman's laugh. And in a way, the descriptions of the characters in that little section are quite brutal. But that little phrase, Negro sunshine, and Stein's little punning, like black sunshine, this Negro being a sort of polite term at the moment for, that's not nigger, is the polite term used at the time. So in some ways she's quite progressive, but it's also a play on the idea of blackness and sunshine, seemingly opposites. But that sort of pun was really interesting to me. And so I started making a series of drawings based on it. So I began to use Baldwin and coal dust, and the paintings became denser and denser because the coal dust does the thing that I'm always interested in, which is materializes something, language, but also obscures it. So the minute you add coal dust to this wet oil stick, it becomes more material, it becomes literally weightier, but it also becomes more abstract. And so taking that further, the paintings started, being these black on black kind of abstractions. And I remember once one of these paintings was in a museum, in a show, and had this wall label attached to it that clearly there was some anxiety about the painting being difficult to read because whoever wrote the wall label had transcribed the text of the painting from the painting, instead of, and I thought, well, clearly there's a book that there's from, but I realized, this is an anxiety that people will struggle reading this text, and so they need to have it explained to them on the wall label, but the text is difficult to read, so the wall label said, the rage of the disesteem, unknown blank, 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 like all the gaps because the person who transcribed the text couldn't read it either. And I realized this is, the museum's anxiety about visitors, that the possibility that the struggle with this text and its opacity, its obscurity, can't be part of the work, that the text has to be kind of fully frontal in some ways. And so to counter that, they have to present this text next to the text painting in order so that people don't have to bother to struggle with the painting itself. So that was a sort of interesting revelation about that work. And that's a detail of one of the paintings in this series. And the things that I was looking at are things like this, a Persian script page from Quran. I don't remember if this is 9th century or 16th. Anyway, so after school classes at the Met, but then after the after school classes, the galleries were still open, and I found myself drawn to the Islamic section of the Met. And I don't read the script, but I was really interested in, the prohibition on images produces this kind of incredible calligraphy. And that, even though I didn't know, I was 15, 16 looking at these things, and I didn't know, it had nothing to do with the work I was doing at the time, but it became important later on, thinking about like the possibilities for the script itself, like what it looks like, rather than what it says necessarily. Oh, I got 3 minutes. I'm gonna speed it up. Okay, back to that Negro Sunshine drawing again. That drawing got me interested in neon, but in a strange way. The studio I'm in New York has a neon maker in one of the spaces, and I'd gone by his shop many, many years and never gone in because I don't make neon, so there was nothing. There are also a lot of, I'm interested in taking things and sort of working with them, and that sort of comes with John's, his quote of take an object, do something to it, do something else to it. And my version of that is like take a word, do something to it, do something else to it. So this first neon that used that word America was from 2006, maybe. And it's what you saw before. It's the word in neon, black paint on the front. So both present and eclipsed at the same time. Here's a variation of it where all of the front and back of the letters have been painted in black paint. And so as it's installed and deinstalled, the paint chips off. So these little points of light come out of it, sort of imperfect mirror of the word. I was also interested in Caspar David Friedrich. These, I think it's called either Traveler or Wanderer over a Sea of Fog, but it's these genre paintings called Rückenfigure, pardon my German, back figure. So a figure in a landscape looking at a landscape, but you see that figure from the back. And I was looking at many things, and I'll show you some of the things I was looking at. So Jasper Johns, Gray Alphabet, of course, stencils, not the content so much, but the idea and possibility that text could be used as art. Again, this is the 90s. And I also, because Jasper Johns was primarily a painter, and even though I was looking at a lot of things that were not painting at that moment, I was still very invested in painting as a medium, as a way to make artworks. And so I wanted to not, even in the space of the Whitney program where they showed my paintings upside down, I didn't want to give up painting as a way to make art, but needed to find a new way to make my paintings. And the other image is a Rauschenberg, I think one of the black paintings. And what was interesting about that for me was he's not using stencils, he's using newspaper and collage and this black paint. And so the text in that newspaper is partially covered with that black paint, but it appears there, and this sort of like appearance and disappearance, the knowledge that this text exists under that black paint, I think was an influence on me. And in the end, I think I'm much more interested in Rauschenberg now than I was at that moment. At that moment, I was a Johns person. It's sort of like that Matisse, Picasso, thing. I was a Johns person. Now I'm more a Rauschenberg person. I was also interested. There's another Johns painting, the 1960 flag, I think. I was interested in these sort of things out in the world, a flag, a text that exists in a novel or an essay, something out in the world that's brought into the space of painting. Another influence is David Hammond's, literally this flag, the African-American flag, changing the colors of the American flag to reflect the red, black, and green of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. This is flying on 125th Street on a flagpole attached to the Studio Museum in Harlem. And David Hammons is one of these, he's basically it, you know. When and if we go to heaven, he will be there. He's kind of a touchstone for a lot of artists of my generation, and I think a lot of artists in general now. So I saw this flag when it first went up because I was working at the Studio Museum in Harlem. But also I love that he talks about sort of like magical things happen when you mess with a symbol. And I think a lot of his work deals with this sort of transformations of the known, you know, just changing the colors on that flag. It's impossible to do this flag anymore after the 9/11 in New York. The country became very nationalistic, and so you could not fuck with the American flag. So apparently these could not be made for many years. But even that becomes part of the story of the artwork. Here's another Hammons piece called Night Train, and I love Hammons also because he's attentive to materials. The coal kind of at the bottom there, the bottles are night train liquor, you know, he collected in Harlem. But also it's a pun, the night train. You know, there's a James Brown song called Night Train, and it's about this mobility from south to north and all those kinds of puns, but also the sort of specificity of the material that he uses is really interesting and inspiring to me.